Thank you for attending today's training, which will cover preliminary and final design authorizations and timing of NEPA approval. My name is Jessica Pilarski, and I will be your facilitator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics. Today's training is being recorded and will be made available on SharePoint to attendees following the session. We are also offering a March 12th session that will be identical to today's presentation, so it is not necessary to attend both days. Please save your questions until the end of the presentation, at which point you can use the raise your hand feature or chat box to ask questions. Our team can go over the hour mark if we don't get to all questions by then. We will have two presenters discussing federal authorizations and NEPA, as well as a representative from RIPD covering some additional slides on STIP-TIP timing. Now, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Dennis Atkins, Division Chief of the Environmental Planning Division. Dennis?
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. I would also like to introduce Jennifer Martin from EPLD, who will be helping me with this presentation, along with the Division Chief from the Regional and Intermodal Planning Division, Tara Panders, who will talk about how the TIP-STIP process fits into this discussion. So let's get started. This training is intended to provide guidance on U.S. DOT Order 6640.1A from 2010 and how it relates to SHA's project development process for projects seeking to utilize federal funds. Moving forward, to make things simple, I will just refer to this as the order. The order clarifies Federal Highway's policy on permissible project-related activities that may be advanced prior to the conclusion of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA process. According to the order, federal agencies may not commit resources that would prejudice the selection of alternatives before making a NEPA decision. In addition, until NEPA approval is obtained, no action limiting the choice of reasonable alternatives may be taken by a federal agency. Although not all SHA projects require the analysis of alternatives, Federal Highway has directed that these restrictions on design activities during the NEPA process apply to all federally funded projects, regardless of whether an alternative analysis is required. Additionally, the order applies to all projects using federal dollars, regardless of the method of project delivery. So, this could apply to design build, alternative delivery, IDIQ, or project varying sponsors such as SHA or a local public agency. It applies to all federally funded projects regardless of what phase or phases of the project utilizes federal funds, including preliminary design, final design, and/or construction. For SHA projects to be eligible for federal funding, they must follow the Federal Highway approved project development process that complies with the order. Federal Highway enforces compliance with the order by authorizing federal preliminary engineering, or PE funds, in two phases: preliminary design, which we will refer to as PD, and final design, which we will refer to as FD. This allows Federal Highway to control how far a project is designed prior to obtaining NEPA approval, and in doing so, ensures the consideration of alternatives under NEPA remains unbiased. In other words, Federal Highway is asking SHA to take 2 bites of the funding apple during preliminary engineering, which is not what SHA had done in the past. For each project, Federal Highway needs to first authorize PD funding and then make a second authorization for FD funding. In addition, each authorization constitutes a federal action requiring NEPA approval. I know this chart is challenging to read, so we will drop it in the chat for you to use later. This flow chart details SHA's project development process, identifying the steps involved in requesting preliminary engineering funds. It includes key decision points as well as the typical timing of various items such as NEPA approval. In addition, the chart shows multiple paths forward based on the status or specific needs of individual projects. We will walk through much of this flowchart in the remainder of this presentation and provide additional details on the process and the reasoning behind it. What is preliminary design? Simply put, PD consists of the engineering activities that are necessary to obtain NEPA approval. Basically, you need to do enough engineering to make the NEPA decision. There is no predefined or finite list of activities that are allowable during PD. However, the list shown here provides a general sense of the types of activities SHA usually completes during PD. To put it in the context of SHA's project design milestones, PD usually takes the project through preliminary investigation and sometimes up to semifinal review. For federal reimbursement, project managers should think in this mindset. Preliminary design leads to final design. The SHA milestones weave into this process. Other activities may be completed under PD depending on the needs of the specific project. When in doubt, ask. Please reach out to the Federal Aid Programming Section and/or EPLD for guidance before proceeding with project activities you may be questioning could be done in PD or FD. Although not specified by the order, Federal Highway has expressed its opinion that a project should not reach the final review milestone while still in PD. PD can be anything, except a handful of activities that the order specifically designs as strictly final design. In rare cases, even those activities restricted to FD could be completed under PD if SHA receives prior approval from Federal Highway. Although the order does not specifically classify the majority of design activities as either PD or FD activities, SHA's individual offices and/or divisions may decide to standardize the list of activities they intend to complete during PD versus FD. For example, the Office of Structures has developed such a list. This list is being placed in the chat. Moving on, we talked about the two phases, preliminary design and final design. NEPA is required to request federal highway authorization of PE funds at each phase. However, these NEPA approvals are not the same. The NEPA approval needed for the authorization of PD funds is separate from the NEPA approval required for the authorization of FD funds. The reason for this is because NEPA applies to and provides environmental clearance for a specific federal action. For the purposes of PD authorization, the federal action for which NEPA approval is granted consists of the engineering to define the elements of a proposed action or alternatives so social, economic, and environmental effects can be assessed. This comes directly from the Federal Highway NEPA regulations at 23 CFR 771. It means, in other words, that the federal action for authorizing PD funds is the preliminary engineering activities necessary to obtain approval of NEPA for project implementation. For FD authorization, approval of NEPA for the actual project implementation is required. The federal action approved under NEPA for project implementation includes the remaining engineering activities necessary to complete the project design in final design, as well as right-of-way acquisition or utilities if required, and ultimately construction of the proposed project. It is important to note that activities such as right-of-way acquisition and utility relocations must be identified as part of the scope of work included in the approved NEPA document if those activities are to be advanced prior to the end of final design. Lastly, if elements of the project change in final design, a NEPA reevaluation must be completed by EPLD. However, SHA's goal is to complete only one NEPA reevaluation during final design. Therefore, whenever possible, a NEPA reevaluation should be completed near the end of final design to ensure it captures any changes that have occurred since NEPA approval was granted. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jen, who will get more into initiating a project. Jen?
Thanks, Dennis. Let's break down the parts of the overall project development process, starting with project initiation. When we kick off a project, before PMs request PD funding, they should check with the EMs to see whether NEPA approval for project implementation already exists. Sometimes it does, and that can change the whole path forward. So, when might NEPA approval already exist? Let's review some examples. Older projects that were paused. Maybe PE started years ago, NEPA approval was completed, but funding got pulled before FD. In those cases, that NEPA approval may still be valid, depending on whether anything has changed since then. Another example would be corridor projects being built in segments. Some big corridors, like I-81 in Washington County or Maryland 210 in Prince George's County, are being designed and constructed in smaller, manageable pieces. For those, NEPA approval covers the entire corridor. So when we start PE on one of those segments, that segment already has NEPA approval, meaning we don't have to start over at PD. Also, some projects fit completely within Appendix A PCE. These are routine, low-impact actions that Federal Highway and EPLD have already agreed have no potential for environmental impact anywhere. Examples include resurfacing, minor structure repairs, modifying existing signals, cleaning, painting non-historic bridges, installing fixed static signs, and more. It's the EM's responsibility to determine whether a project fits within an Appendix A. If it does, that Appendix A PCE is the NEPA approval. If NEPA approval is already in place, the project should be moving into or already in final design. In most cases, it shouldn't need more PD funds, though the occasional exception does pop up. EPLD often gets asked, do NEPA documents expire? Well, they don't technically expire the way permits do, but they can become outdated, or maybe environmental conditions have changed or regulations shifted. When that happens, we need to do a reevaluation. If there's no prior NEPA approval for a project, and SHA plans to use federal funding for preliminary design, then the PM needs to request an Appendix A PCE for preliminary design from the EM. A couple key things about the Appendix A PCE. It must be issued by EPLD, and just a reminder, the expiration date shown on the Appendix A PCE refers to the expiration of the programmatic agreement, not the expiration of the PCE itself. It only authorizes two things: establishing the federal aid project agreement and authorization of PD funding. It does not authorize project implementation or construction. For projects using state funds or other non-federal funds for preliminary design, NEPA approval is not required to start design activities. So what should PMs and EMs do at the time the Appendix A PCE is requested? PMs should lay out a comprehensive scope of all activities expected during PD. The goal here is to avoid running out of PD funds and having to modify the federal aid project agreement later to add more. EMs need to flag any outreach or agency coordination needs. Things like public involvement or complex coordination can affect the timing of NEPA approval and the overall project schedule. Those considerations should be built in early. A project PM and EM should coordinate and agree on the point in the process when NEPA approval should be sought. EPLD can help PMs understand potential environmental issues or situations where heavier agency coordination might be required. That information tells us how much design work is needed before full NEPA approval can be issued and how realistic the schedule is. Why all this matters. Accurately scoping PD makes everything run smoother when the project transitions into final design. It also helps prevent underscoping PD, which is when design work has to pause because NEPA approval isn't in place yet, and we have to wait for FD funds to be authorized. Once the PD scope is set, the timing for NEPA approval is agreed on, and the EM has issued the Appendix A PCE for preliminary design. The next step is for the PM to coordinate with federal aid. This coordination is to request approval of the federal aid project agreement, which also authorizes the funding for PD. What needs to be included in that request? The engineer's cost estimate for PD activities. PM should make sure this includes any non-participating costs, especially if work began before federal authorization. A specific scope of work. This should outline the design activities in enough detail to support obtaining NEPA approval for project implementation. The authorization must also include the Appendix A PCE for preliminary design, the TIP-STIP reference, information on any consultant involvement, and the approved Form 42. This one is for SHA use only. It doesn't get submitted to Federal Highway, but it still needs to be part of the internal package. Once Federal Highway authorizes the PD funds, design activities can officially begin. The overall goal during PD is to complete enough design to obtain NEPA approval for project implementation. To do that, PMs need to understand the basic information EMs will need to prepare the NEPA document. The exact details can vary from project to project, but typically EMs will need the following: a full and accurate description of the project scope of work, which should clearly lay out what the project is doing and any major elements that could influence impacts. A worst-case limit of disturbance, or LOD, that should cover the area the PM is reasonably certain will include all proposed improvements. This means including space for stormwater management, utility relocations, right-of-way needs, including fee simple, easements, right of entries, landscaping, mitigation areas, and, if possible, staging and construction access. Sometimes, depending on when NEPA approval is being requested, the design might not be far enough along to find the exact LOD for every project element. In those cases, the PM should conservatively estimate the LOD to avoid underestimating impacts in the NEPA document. NEPA also requires a reasonable calculation of impacts to wetlands, streams, floodplains, trees and forests, and right-of-way. It doesn't have to be final design level detail, but it does need to be reliable enough for disclosure and agency coordination. We also need all completed coordination with resource agencies, such as DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Maryland Historical Trust. All required agency coordination must be completed before NEPA approval can be issued. And to support that coordination, the project may need certain level of design detail and impact assessment. And one final caveat. If information needed for agency coordination is delayed, that can delay NEPA approval. So having complete, timely inputs is critical. Because every project is different, the timing of NEPA approval is always project specific. It depends on things like the project scope, where it's located, what environmental resources are present, and whether an alternatives analysis is required. Here are some of the major factors that can influence when NEPA approval can realistically be obtained. If the project has potential impacts to threatened and endangered species, please note these can require extra coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and/or DNR, which could extend the timeline. Another example is if the project impacts to DNR-owned lands. Projects affecting these properties often need substantial coordination with DNR before NEPA approval can move forward. Similarly, potential impacts to public parks or historic sites. These usually trigger Section 4F considerations. That typically involves coordination with the park owner, local, state, or federal, the Maryland Historical Trust, and Federal Highway. Impacts to the National Park Service properties is another example. These may require additional coordination with MPS, including obtaining a special use permit. Federal Highway may need to be involved as well. Less common but complex situations sometimes arise for a project. For example, in one recent project, evidence of a former cemetery was discovered within previously acquired right-of-way. This triggered extensive coordination with the local community and significantly affected project timing. Time of year restrictions must also be considered. Some resources, such as certain threatened and endangered species or aquatic habitats, have agency-set time of year restrictions for construction. These constraints need to be factored into the overall project schedule. They may also influence the best time to seek NEPA approval. All of these potential project impacts, if identified during PD scoping, can help determine how much design detail is needed in PD and when in the design process it makes the most sense to request NEPA approval. So, what is the typical timing for NEPA approval? Even though timing varies project to project, there are some general patterns. For projects not requiring an alternatives analysis, NEPA approval is typically obtained between the PI and semi-final review milestones. Federal Highway has stated that projects should not reach final review while still in the PD phase, and the same applies to NEPA approval. Federal Highway prefers that NEPA approval not be left until final review. For projects that do require an alternatives analysis, NEPA should be obtained no later than the preliminary investigation milestone. Federal Highway selects the single preferred alternative at the time of the NEPA approval. SHA prefers not to take multiple alternatives beyond preliminary design. Ideally, only the selected alternative moves forward to 100% design. For projects using state funds for PD, PM should also remember, even if preliminary design is completed using state or non-federal funds, NEPA approval for project implementation is still required if SHA intends to use federal funds for final design or construction only. In those cases, the timing of NEPA approval should follow the same standards as if PD were federally funded. Once NEPA approval for project implementation is obtained, the project should begin transitioning from the preliminary design PD phase into the final FD phase. But an important point here, NEPA approval does not mean design work has to stop while waiting for FD authorization from Federal Highway. Any design activities that were originally scoped under PD can continue under the existing PD authorization while the FD funding request is being prepared reviewed, and approved. Requesting an FD authorization. If the project will use federal funds for final design, the PM needs to coordinate with federal aid to develop the request for FD authorization. There are two different scenarios. One, if PD was federally funded, the FD request becomes a modification to the existing federal aid project agreement. This modification adds the final design activities. And two, if PD was completed using state or other non-federal funds. In this case, a new federal aid project agreement must be established, and this new agreement covers final design only. What must be included in the FD funding request? The package sent to Federal Highway needs to include a detailed scope of work for final design activities, the engineer's cost estimate for FD activities, which should include any non-participating costs, particularly if work continued before FD authorization, and the approved NEPA document for project implementation. Once Federal Highway reviews and approves the request, the project is officially transitioned into the final design phase, and FD activities can fully proceed. One important reminder, any activities not authorized under PD that start before FD authorization are not eligible for federal reimbursement. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tara Penders, who is going to talk about how TIP-STIP process fits into this discussion. Tara?
Thanks, Jen. Hello, I'm Tara Penders, Chief of the Regional and Intermodal Planning Division, or RIPD. RIPD regional planners are tasked with fulfilling the U.S. Department of Transportation and federal highway requirements for metropolitan transportation planning. These requirements include designating a metropolitan planning organization, or an MPO, for any urbanized region with a population of at least 50,000 people, with the aim of coordinating transportation investments across the region. Maryland includes 6 MPOs that cover the following regions: Baltimore, Washington, Hagerstown, a portion of Calvert and St. Mary's counties, Wilmington, and Salisbury. Another federal planning requirement is maintaining a Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, which is a capital program required of each MPO. The statewide TIP, or Transportation Improvement Program, which we call a STIP, is also required and includes rural projects outside of MPO boundaries, statewide projects such as statewide bridge inspection projects, and all MPO TIPs. This document basically includes every federally funded project in the state of Maryland. For this reason, every TIP amendment also requires a STIP amendment, which is why RIPD groups these actions together. RIPD regional planners submit SHA projects for inclusion in the TIPs and in the STIP. These projects are updated periodically and typically cover 4 fiscal years. Between TIP update cycles, RIPD planners submit TIP and STIP amendments to accommodate increases or shifting of federal project funding. RIPD planners are Form 42 approvers and are responsible for identifying the need for TIP-STIP amendments based on funding and schedule changes included in Form 42. Moving to the next slide. RIPD planners approve Form 42s by providing a TIP and a STIP reference, as indicated by the red oval at the bottom of the Form 42 on this slide. A tip-stip reference is required for all NEPA approvals and every authorization of federal funding. RIPD has seen a trend of adding project funding at the transition from PD to FD. Because TIP and STIP amendments can take up to 3 months to be approved, RIPD urges project managers to identify funding needs 4 months before authorization requests or NEPA approvals are planned. Project changes that trigger TIP-STIP amendments include adding a new project, adding funding in a current project phase, such as preliminary engineering, adding funding in a new phase, such as right-of-way or utilities, which is often requested at the final design authorization milestone. Shifting phase dates, for example, if right-of-way funding was funded to start in fiscal year 2028 and a new Form 42 indicates a start in fiscal year 27, the TIP and STIP may need to be updated. There is a lot to know about TIP-STIP policies and processes, even if you're not an expert. RIPD is planning a training about TIP-STIP considerations. Be on the lookout for a save the date notice, which is coming soon. I'll now pass the presentation back to Jen, who will talk about what is involved in the next step in the project development process, final design.
Thank you, Tara. So what is final design, or FD? The simplest way to put it is FD includes any remaining design activities that weren't completed under the PD authorization. FD is where the project design is taken all the way to PS&E, or 100% design completion. And remember, NEPA approval is required before a project can transition from PD to FD. So, FD activities can begin only after NEPA approval is obtained and Federal Highway has authorized the use of FD funds. What design activities can occur during FD? The short answer is any. The order does not place restrictions on what design activities may occur during the FD phase. It's also important to note that anything you're allowed to do during PD is also allowed during FD. But the reverse is not true. There are certain activities that are restricted to FD only under the order. These include the development of final plans, the project site plan, final quantities, and the final engineer's estimate for construction. These 4 activities may not be completed under PD authorization unless there is prior coordination with Federal Highway and Federal Highway approves the activity in advance. Otherwise, these activities must wait until after NEPA approval is issued and the project has formally transitioned into the FD phase. It's understood that project design is iterative. It evolves as the project moves forward. Because NEPA approval for project implementation is usually obtained well before design is fully finalized, it's completely expected that design changes will occur. These design changes can sometimes modify the project scope of work, the worst case limit of disturbance, and/or the environmental impacts that were disclosed in the approved NEPA document. When that happens, a NEPA reevaluation may be required. However, not all design changes trigger a reevaluation. If design changes affect the worst case LOD or the environmental impacts, Federal Highway regulations require that the NEPA approval be reevaluated. This is exactly why developing a conservative worst case LOD at the time of NEPA approval is so important. A conservative LOD gives the project some flexibility to refine design later without exceeding the limits upon which NEPA approval was based. The purpose of a NEPA reevaluation is not to replace the original NEPA approval for project implementation. It is to confirm whether the original NEPA class of action is still valid or supplemental NEPA documentation is required. For the vast majority of SHA projects, the NEPA class of action is a categorical exclusion, or CE. This includes both programmatic CEs, or PCEs, and minor PCEs. Being classified as a CE means the project does not involve significant impacts and therefore does not require an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. Who reviews reevaluations? Reevaluations for federal highway reviewed CEs must also be reviewed and approved by Federal Highway. Reevaluations for PCEs and minor PCEs are reviewed and certified within EPLD. And because NEPA approval typically occurs at the end of the PD phase, reevaluations generally occur during the FD phase. As previously mentioned, design and/or LOD changes happen during the course of a project development. However, the goal is to capture all these changes post-NEPA approval and complete only one reevaluation during the final design phase. This aligns with the December 2025 memo issued by Deputy Chief Engineer Ray Moravec to SHA's senior leadership team titled Limiting the Number of Project Environmental Reevaluations During the Final Design Phase. A copy of this memo is being dropped into chat. The single reevaluation should occur near the end of FD, when design is nearly complete and the PM can confidently say that no additional substantial design changes are expected. Ideally, the reevaluation would be based on final review or 90% plans and would be approved between the final review milestone and PS&E. When might a reevaluation be needed earlier in FD? In rare cases, exceptions are allowed when specific circumstances require it. These include, but are not limited to, the need to advance utility work that was not identified in the original NEPA approved scope, the need to advance right-of-way acquisition when right-of-way requirements have changed or expanded since NEPA approval. In these situations, an early reevaluation may be necessary to keep the project moving. However, and this is critical, a second comprehensive reevaluation will still be required near the end of FD. This final reevaluation captures all changes to the scope of work, the worst case LOD, and environmental impacts, as well as confirms that the NEPA class of action remains valid. Why this matters. This is exactly why it is so important that the scope of work provided to the EM for the initial NEPA approval be as comprehensive as possible and include all activities expected to occur as part of the project. When the scope is complete and accurate from the beginning, it greatly reduces the likelihood of needing multiple reevaluations and helps keep the project on schedule. Dennis will now summarize some of the key points we learned today.
Thank you, Jen and Tara. To recap, the key takeaways from today's training focus on, and I cannot emphasize this enough, early communication between the PMs and EMs, which is extremely important to both the schedule and budget for a project. First, it will ensure that the proper path is being followed and the appropriate funding, PD or FD, is being requested. It will also help the PM understand how much design is needed for the project to receive NEPA approval so that the PD phase can properly and adequately be scoped. It will also help the PM understand when, during the development of the project design, they can expect to get NEPA approval, which will assist in creating and maintaining the overall project schedule. The second key takeaway is that federally funded projects require 2 bites at the funding apple. Once to initiate PD and again to transition from PD into FD. Remember, NEPA approval is needed for each bite. Finally, we want to emphasize that accurate scoping of PD and appropriate timing of NEPA approval will facilitate a smoother transition from PD to FD and can minimize delays. Jessica, let me turn the presentation back to you.
Great, thank you, Dennis. Now that the team has completed their presentation and we prepare to open it up to attendees for questions, we'd like to start with 4 common questions we hear related to today's topics, as these may spark other questions from our audience. Thanks in advance to our panelists consisting of Bob Maimone from EPLD, Chrissy Brandt from EPLD, Michael Holmes from FAPS, and Tara Penders from RIPD. All right, let's go to our first FAQ here. The question is, are preliminary design activities and final design activities mutually exclusive? Bob, can you answer that question for our group today?
Sure, Jess, thanks. I can take this one. Are preliminary design activities and final design activities mutually exclusive? Short answer is no, they are not. PD and FD activities can be done in or most activities, I should say, can be done in either PD or the FD stage, depending on what the individual project's needs are. There are, however, a small number of specific design activities that are restricted by the order to occur only after NEPA approval during the final design stage. But there are no such restrictions during final design. So what that means is that any design activities that are allowed during the preliminary design stage may also be completed during the final design stage.
Great, thank you, Bob. Okay, next question. Once NEPA approval for project implementation is granted by Federal Highway, do design activities have to stop until final design funds are authorized by Federal Highway? Chrissy, can you help us out with that one?
Yep, I can take that one, Jess. So the short answer to that question is no. Design activities do not have to stop. While PD is intended to include design activities necessary to obtain NEPA, and then that also signifies the point where the project would transition to final design, it's still allowable to continue work on any remaining design activities that were authorized in your PD authorization. So even after NEPA is obtained and before final design is authorized, you can continue working on those scoped PD activities.
Thanks, Chrissy. Okay, our third FAQ here. Do Appendix A PCEs for PD expire? Do we need a new Appendix A for PD if the expiration date has passed? Bob, how about you take this one?
Sure, Jess. No, Appendix A PCEs for preliminary design don't expire. Although I think the questions come up because there is an expiration date listed on the Appendix A PCE form. That date actually refers to the expiration of SHA's current programmatic agreement with Federal Highway, which does expire and needs to be updated and reapproved every 5 years. However, FHWA has confirmed for us that any NEPA approvals, including the Appendix A PCEs for preliminary design that were granted under the programmatic agreement, remain valid even after that programmatic agreement expires.
Thanks, Bob. And our final question before we open it up to attendees. When we get a NEPA approval for project implementation on a project with multiple locations, XB and XQ contracts, how do we know which locations are approved? I'm going to ask Michael Holmes to help us out with that one.
Hi, Jess. That's a great question. So when we go to submit these to Federal Highway, we need to be able to show evidence that each location has been considered and is a part of that NEPA. So we need either a NEPA that lists multiple locations, a NEPA for each individual location, or at least an email from your environmental manager that indicates that an overarching NEPA document, Appendix A, PCE, is valid for those specific locations.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, now that we've wrapped up our FAQs, we'd like to open it up to questions using the raise your hand feature or the chat. Jen Martin is going to be helping me monitor the chat. Thanks, Jen, in advance. So let's go to our first question. Jen, right now, I'm not seeing any hands raised. If you would like to ask a question, oh, we have Angela Smith. Angela, why don't you go first?
I have a question. So whenever you're in PD, you didn't finish everything, FD is approved, you can continue working on the PD. Is there any overlap? I mean, how is the funding tracked? I mean, do we have to worry about that at all? Especially if you're, or actually more better, if you're in, so your FD is approved and you're still working on PD activities, how does that affect the money that's been approved? So if the value of the work was approved as PD, but not again an FD, but now you're using FD money to do the work that was approved in PD with a specific value. How does that? Just worry about, would you overspend your FD because you didn't use it all in PD?
Sure.
That
I'll
might be
take
the
this
easier
one.
way of asking.
Yeah. So to kind of rephrase the question, I guess you're saying you had items that were scoped for preliminary design, but you've moved into final design, you're still finishing up some of those preliminary design items. That's not a problem, because when you ask for final design, you're telling us how much additional money is needed for final design. The money that was there for preliminary design doesn't go away.
Okay.
So you would be able to just keep continuing.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Angela and Michael. Jen, I'm going to turn it over to the chat.
Yeah, we do have a question in chat. The question is, can the Form 30 for right-of-way funding and right-of-way appraisals be completed in PD? That would allow acquisition only to be allowed in FD.
Can one of our presenters or panelists answer this one, or is this one we need to follow up on later?
I'm not sure I can speak to, this is Bob Money. I'm not sure that I can speak to the Form 30 piece of it. What I can tell you is that in terms of right-of-way appraisals, everything up through appraisals, I believe, can be completed prior to NEPA approval. So that would lead to, that could be done during the PD phase. But we can't go anywhere beyond that, I believe. As far as completing a Form 30 for that, I'm not positive of that.
And I would say you cannot complete the Form 30 until you've received your federal agreement for the right-of-way.
Thanks, Bob and Michael. Also, just to let attendees know, if you think of a question after this meeting, or if your question didn't get answered, we do have Dennis and Michael's contact information on this slide if you'd like to email them your question, and we could definitely follow up with you. I'm not seeing any more hands raised. Oh, we just got one. Thank you. Sarah.
Yep, and we'll go to Sarah, Jessica, and then we do have another question in chat as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Jen. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks. I was just wondering, is there a specific process that needs to be followed at the end of a project if you don't spend all of the federal funding that you requested?
Yes, at the completion of your project, you would let us know that the project is finished, and we'll take it through the final voucher process and close the project. So just notify us.
Okay, but it is kind of follow-up question. It's better to, obviously you want to request as close to what you think you need as possible, but it's better to, I'm assuming it's better to like overestimate a little bit than underestimate a little bit.
I would say don't overestimate, don't underestimate.
Well,
just
yeah.
do the best you can with your estimate. And
Right.
and that's the goal, right? These projects We've all been there. Sometimes they end up being a little bit more, a little bit less. Certainly, you don't want to go over what's set up on your agreement. So if you think you're going to be going over what your estimate was for, then let us know, and we'll work through getting you additional funding. But yeah, I mean, the goal is to be accurate, right? As accurate as you can be for an estimate. So I'm not going to say shoot for the moon and then spend less. Give us a realistic estimate, though.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you both.
Hi, this is Tara. I'd like to add on if I could.
Sure.
If you're running against your authorized amount for federal funding, you should let RIPD know as well, because there may be a need for a tip-stip action.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, Jen, I think we could go to our additional question in the chat.
Sure. The question is, how are the estimates for consultants versus state labor be completed in PD when it is unclear who will be working on the project from support offices?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess my best advice is reach out to those offices and ask. So, for instance, I know EPLD relies heavily on consultants, so maybe reach out to them and have that discussion with them when you're putting your estimate together. Same for any other office you might be working with.
Yeah, I would agree with Mike. This is Chrissy from environmental planning. It's really important for the project managers kind of at the beginning of their project to coordinate not just with the environmental planning for the NEPA component, but also the other support divisions to kind of give you an idea of the extent of potential coordination that's needed. And then that will help inform your estimate for the project.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we got some more in the chat, Jen.
Yep, we do. 2 questions. Which office will deal with tip-stip reference and how to get information about the tip-stip?
This is Tara again. That's us. That's RIPD. Like I said in the presentation, we provide references on the Form 42. And if you ever have any questions about tip-stip in your project, just reach out to me or Nate Evans, who's the assistant division chief.
Thanks, Tara. All right, I'm going to check I don't see any hands raised at this point. Give it another second and see if we get any more questions coming in before we wrap up. All right. I think we're going to start concluding here. So I'd like to thank today's presenters, panelists, and attendees for a very informative session. Like I said, if you think of a question after our session today, feel free to email Dennis or Michael at the provided emails on the slide. And this training will now conclude, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much.